Detroit, Michigan, 1956. The automobile factory whistle has just fallen silent. A pair of work shoes rests beside the door. In the kitchen, an onion sits half-chopped, a bag of potatoes is tucked beneath the table, and several cans of food stand near a window pane clouded with steam. The cast-iron skillet still holds the scent of butter from breakfast. Above it is the wooden recipe box, its lid slightly open. One card reads, Meatloaf, Detroit, 1957. Beneath it, a penciled note says, mix until it feels right. The small kitchen is still carefully tended. Simple ingredients demand years of experience. She listens to the oil, watches the butter, touches the meat, and tastes it before calling the family to the table. Her hands have memorized supper. Soon, green tomatoes will become crisp golden slices. Gelatin mold on a church table will tell a story of modernity. The number one dish will show why hands can tell when a meatloaf is just right. When those old recipe cards remind you of someone who once cooked for the family, subscribe to the channel. Tonight, pull your chair closer to the stove. 25 suppers begin with the number 25, the cast-iron sounds of everyday suppers. When the first card was set aside, the story left the recipe box and moved closer to the stovetop. Before canned soup and gelatin molds made their way onto the post-war supper table, many evening meals still began in a black cast-iron skillet. The fat heated up. The skillet handle gradually warmed in her palm. She listened to the oil, watched the color of the food, and knew when it was time to turn it. Dish number 25. Crispy, fried, green tomatoes. The first frost of the season crept across the small gardens behind the rows of bungalows around Chicago. Before the evening light faded completely, she stepped out the back door, lifted the still green tomatoes from the vines, and placed them in a shallow basket. In 1955, a pound of fresh tomatoes cost about 27 cents, while a pound of cornmeal cost about 13 cents. A few tomatoes left at the end of the season were still enough to make a hot plateful for the center of the table. She sliced the tomatoes into thick rounds, sprinkled them with salt, and rolled each slice in pale yellow cornmeal. When the tomatoes touched the hot fat, a sharp sizzle rose around the edge of the skillet. She kept the spatula resting beside her, waiting for the crust to set and listening for the sound to soften. Only then did the spatula slide beneath each slice, lifting it with one neat, steady motion. The smell of toasted cornmeal blended with the scent of hot fat and drifted through the room, where the window panes had already turned cold. In homes that kept a small garden behind the kitchen, even fruit that had not had time to ripen still had its place at the table. The frost did not take supper away. Dish number 24. Pan-seared pork chops. The pork chop met the hot cast iron with a deep, full sizzle. It placed one hand on the skillet handle, felt the heat travel through the metal, and left the spatula untouched. In Kansas City, Missouri, in 1956, pork chops cost about 79 cents per pound. For families living near meat processing plants, they were familiar enough for a mid-week supper, yet valuable enough that every drop of juice in the meat needed to be preserved. She seasoned the chop with salt, sprinkled it with pepper, and heated a thin layer of fat. The chop was placed in the skillet and left undisturbed until the underside turned brown. Small bubbles of fat formed around the edges. The rich smell of cooking meat deepened, clinging to the checkered kitchen towel and the metal salt box on the shelf. She turned the chop once. Near the end, she pressed a fingertip lightly against the center to judge its firmness. Years spent beside the stove had taught her the difference between a piece of meat that was still tender and juicy, and one that had remained in the skillet too long. She knew with a single touch. Dish number 23, liver and onions. The onions cooked slowly in butter, changing from cloudy white to golden brown. Their sweetness spread through the kitchen before the slices of liver appeared, softening the strong flavor waiting behind them. 1955, among mining families around Scranton, Pennsylvania, a pound of onions cost about 8 cents, while lard cost about 21 cents. Liver was usually found in the more economical section of the meat counter, substantial enough that even a small amount could give weight to the evening meal. She sliced the onions, let them gradually soften in the skillet, then spooned them onto a white enamel plate. The liver was coated with a thin layer of flour, placed in hot butter, and quickly seared on both sides. Its sizzle was sharper than the sound of the onions. The edges of the liver slices darkened after only a few minutes. She watched the surface of the skillet very closely. As soon as the seconders, each slice was lifted out and covered with onions. A little too slowly, and the texture would become dry and grainy. At exactly the right moment, the liver remained tender beneath the sweet onions. Near the door, the miner's coat still hung in place. Low light fell across the plate that had just been served. Hot skillet. Little time. The first 3 dishes kept the cook close to the stove, listening to every change in the fat and watching the food brown. But on some evenings, the children were already hungry. Footsteps would soon be returning to the porch, and the clock showed only 15 minutes remaining. On those nights, supper had to move faster, 15 minutes before the family sits down. After suppers that required the cook to remain close beside the skillet, the pace of the kitchen began to quicken. The clock hands moved closer to quitting time. The sound of young children's footsteps ran through the hallway. Outside buses carried workers home to rows of houses. As time grew short, the kitchen narrowed down to 1 skillet, 1 pot, and a few familiar ingredients. The quick supper still required care, because slightly higher heat could burn the bread, a little too much milk could thin the soup, and sugar left too long in the skillet would lose its gentle sweetness. Dish number 20. Grilled cheese. Sandwich. 2 slices of white bread lay neatly on the cutting board. The wooden-handled knife spread butter from one corner to the other, leaving a thin sheen beneath the kitchen light. In Newark, New Jersey, 1956, a pound of bread cost about 18 cents, while processed American cheese cost about 58 cents per pound. A few slices of cheese placed between the bread were enough to make a familiar supper for young children, or a meal adults could prepare for themselves when the person who kept the kitchen had grown tired after a day. She placed 1 slice of bread, buttered side down, in the skillet, arranged the cheese on top, and covered it with the remaining slice. The heat was kept at medium-low. Butter melted around the edges of the bread, making a faint crackling sound. She waited until the underside turned golden, flipped the sandwich once, and then pressed it lightly with a flat spatula. The heat passed through the soft interior, melting the cheese until it nearly reached the edges. When the sandwich was placed on the plate, the crust made a small, crisp sound beneath the knife. A glass of milk stood beside it. 2 slices of bread had become a supper. Dish number 21, canned tomato soup. The can opener bit through the tin lid in short, steady turns. When the lid was lifted, the thick red mass of soup slid into the pot with a soft, heavy sound. Around 1957, an 11-ounce can of soup cost nearly 15 cents. In working-class apartments in Newark and many other northeastern cities, this dish often appeared on cold days, busy days, evenings when someone in the household needed something easy to eat. She scraped away all the soup, still clinging to the inside of the can, added milk, and stirred over medium heat. The spoon moved across the bottom of the pot in slow circles, breaking up each thick lump until the surface of the soup became smooth. Some households preferred the richness of butter. Some added a pinch of sugar to soften the acidity. In others, a few turns of black pepper were all that was needed. She tasted it before ladling it out. The ratio of milk to water was rarely written on the recipe card because every family had developed its own preferred flavor. She knew what her family liked. Dish number 20. Pan-fried ham with pineapple. The smell of smoked meat rose first and met the sweet scent of pineapple as the golden rings began to bubble around the edges. The small kitchen suddenly seemed to carry a little of the brightness of some distant place. In 1959, in the suburbs around Los Angeles, ham cost about 61 cents per pound, while a can of pineapple cost about 33 cents. Images of tropical islands, family cars, and colorful suppers were entering post-war life through magazines, advertisements, and supermarket shelves. She placed the ham in the skillet, allowed its fat to render, and flipped it when the underside had browned. Pineapple rings were arranged around the meat. A little brown sugar fell onto the surface of the skillet, melting into a thin syrup and clinging to the edges of the pineapple. She watched the color of the sugar closely, lifting the skillet from the heat before the caramel turned bitter. The dish took about 15 minutes. The young children had soft, sweet pineapple. The adults had hot slices of meat with a deep, smoky flavor. An ordinary Wednesday evening suddenly tasted tropical. The skillet dishes helped supper keep pace with the footsteps returning outside the door. But when summer held the heat between the rows of houses, the kitchen found a different rhythm. Food was taken from the refrigerator, placed on lettuce leaves, and served beneath the sound of the window fan, turning cold suppers beneath the window fan. After the dishes that could be served within 15 minutes, summer forced the kitchen to change its rhythm once again. Heat became trapped between the rows of houses, clung to the curtains, and left a thin layer of moisture on the tabletop. The fan by the window turned steadily, making a drowsy humming sound. Dinner now came together in a cool glass bowl, with a fork and a few ingredients prepared ahead of time. With cold food, she judged the moisture by sight, listened for the crunch beneath the knife, and stopped mixing before everything became too soft. Dish number 19. Tuna salad. The lid of the can opened with a clean snap. She tilted the can over the sink and gently pressed the tuna with a fork until the last stream of liquid fell away and disappeared down the drain. In Baltimore in 1956, a 6.5-ounce can of chunk tuna cost about 35 cents. It appeared in shipyard workers' lunchboxes, on office workers' tables, and in homes that needed a supper kept far away from the heat of the stove. She separated the tuna with the tip of a fork, added mayonnaise 1 spoonful at a time, and mixed in chopped celery, a little onion, or sweet pickle relish. The fork tapped against the side of the bowl with a dry, steady sound. After each turn, she stopped to look. The tuna needed enough moisture to hold together, but each flake still had to keep its shape. Some days, the salad was placed between slices of white bread and wrapped in wax paper. On other days, it rested on cold lettuce leaves beside a few slices of tomato. Sometimes, she hollowed out a large tomato and spooned the tuna into the center. One small can could become many different meals, depending on what was left in the cupboard. The room was still hot and the fan was still turning, but the stove was allowed to rest. Dish number 18. Egg salad sandwiches. The hard-boiled eggs rested beneath cold water. She tapped each one lightly against the side of the bowl, rolled it beneath her palm, and peeled away the cracked shell. Thin white fragments floated on the surface of the water, bumping against one another with every movement of her fingers. In Philadelphia in 1955, a dozen eggs cost about 61 cents, while bread cost about 18 cents per pound. With a few eggs and a loaf of bread, she could prepare packed lunches, a light midday meal, or supper for a sweltering day. The eggs were chopped with a small knife and sometimes mashed directly in the bowl with a fork. She added mayonnaise, mustard, salt, and pepper, then mixed until the yolks evenly coated the pieces of egg white. One household preferred chopped onion. Another wanted celery, so that every bite had an extra crunch. She spooned the filling onto the bread, spread it nearly to the edges, and placed the remaining slice on top. When she cut the sandwich into triangles, the knife passed through the soft bread, while the filling remained neatly inside. The sandwiches were placed on plates with lettuce leaves, or wrapped in wax paper for later. The amount of mayonnaise was rarely written on the card. She looked at the bowl and knew how much her family needed. Dish number 17. Macaroni salad with peas and pickles. The lid of the pickle jar popped open, releasing a cool, sweet and sour scent. She spooned a little pickle juice into the mayonnaise and stirred until the dressing thinned and took on a slight sheen beneath the light from the window. Baltimore in 1956, a 10-ounce package of frozen peas cost about 24 cents. A small jar of sweet pickles cost about 28 cents, while a pint of salad dressing cost about 35 cents. Those ingredients often came together at union picnics, in church basements, and at gatherings where many plates were waiting to be filled. She boiled elbow macaroni, rinsed it under cold water, and let it drain thoroughly. Macaroni was mixed with peas, chopped pickles, and hard-boiled eggs when there were some in the house. The dressing was folded in a little at a time, just enough to coat the macaroni without collecting in a puddle at the bottom of the bowl. The bowl was covered with a cloth and placed in the refrigerator for several hours. During that time, macaroni absorbed more of the tangy flavor, the peas stayed cool, and the pickles still gave a small crunch with every bite. She often saved a little dressing to mix in before taking the salad out, because cold macaroni always needed more moisture than it did when freshly cooked. A large bowl was easy to carry, easy to share, and could be placed in the center of the table for anyone who arrived late. At the end of the gathering, the cloth cover was folded away, the spoon rested at an angle against the bottom, and the bowl usually came home empty. Cold dishes gave the kitchen an evening's rest from the heat of the flame. Then there were days when the meal became even smaller. An egg, a few slices of bread, or a bowl of hot porridge was enough to carry the whole family through the rest of the night. Breakfast became supper. After the cold bowls served beneath the window fan, the kitchen returned to a gentler warmth. In households with shift workers, breakfast and supper often traded places. Eggs, bread, and hot cereal did not care what hour the clock showed. An egg or a bowl of porridge became supper only when the person at the stove understood when to stop. Dish number 3: eggs with toast. It was already dark outside the Detroit window, but in the skillet were 2 eggs usually seen at daybreak. The worker's coat still hung near the door, and the kitchen clock had already passed the usual mealtime. In 1955, a dozen eggs cost about 61 cents, while bread cost about 18 cents per pound. In neighborhoods of automobile workers, those few ingredients were enough to make supper after a long shift. She heated butter or bacon fat, cracked the eggs into the skillet, and lowered the heat. The whites changed from clear to opaque, setting slowly around the 2 yolks that still trembled slightly. At the same time, the bread was placed in the toaster. The sputter of fat blended with the dry click of the toaster behind her. She watched both, lifting the bread when its surface had just turned golden and removing the eggs from the skillet before the yolks began to firm. Dinner began with 2 eggs. Dish number 15: cheesy scrambled eggs. The wooden spatula pushed the eggs from the edge of the skillet toward the center, forming soft folds that still held a sheen beneath the light. Also, in 1955, eggs cost about 61 cents per dozen, while American cheese cost about 58 cents per pound. In Detroit and other factory cities, a small portion of cheese made the plate look fuller after a long day of work. Beat the eggs with a little milk, poured them into the foaming butter, and drew the spatula through the skillet in slow circles. The cheese was folded in while the eggs were still moist. The pale yellow pieces softened, clung to each fold of egg, and left the rich scent of milk fat around the stovetop. She lifted the skillet from the heat while the eggs were still slightly soft. The remaining heat would finish the work. Experience rested in that moment, 1 beat earlier than a new cook usually thought. She stopped before the eggs became dry. Dish number 14: cream of wheat or oatmeal. The wooden spoon touched the bottom of the pot in a slow, steady rhythm. Outside, a Pittsburgh winter pressed its cold against the window panes. Inside, steam from the milk curled around the hand that stirred. In 1955, a 20-ounce package of rolled oats cost about 19 cents, while a quart of milk cost about 22 cents. A bowl of hot cereal could be served in the morning, then return in the evening for young children, someone who was tired, or someone who had just come home after a late shift. She heated milk or water, sprinkled in the cereal or oats a little at a time, and stirred continuously. The mixture gradually thickened, and the sound of the spoons scraping the bottom of the pot grew heavier. The spoon could draw a clear line across the surface, and the two sides still slowly closed together. She added butter or brown sugar and ladled it into an enamel bowl. The pat of butter melted into a small golden streak. The heat pressed against the face of the person seated at the table. One bowl held back the cold night. Those dishes belonged to a kitchen accustomed to measuring heat by sight and time by feel. But during the 1950s, canned foods, gelatin, electric refrigerators, and condensed soup began to make their way onto the table. The old kitchen was learning a new language. Canned foods reached the dinner table. Among the cards with softened corners in the recipe box were several scraps of paper that remained brightly colored with neatly printed words, sometimes cut from the back of a can label. On one card dated 1955, a streak of cream of mushroom soup had dried to an ivory color. Beneath it was a penciled note: add milk if too thick. Canned goods brought convenience into the post-war kitchen, while the hands of the family decided what flavor the dish would carry. Dish number 13, green bean casserole. The cream sauce bubbled around the edges of the baking dish. The layer of fried onions on top gradually crisped, making a faint crackling sound when the spoon touched down. In 1955, in Camden, New Jersey, the recipe for green bean casserole was developed in Campbell's Test Kitchen. At the time, a pound of fresh green beans cost about 22 cents, while a 10-ounce package of frozen beans cost about 24 cents. She mixed the beans with cream of mushroom soup, milk, pepper, and some of the fried onions. The spoon moved through the thick mixture, leaving a white trail that slowly closed behind it. She poured everything into the dish and baked it until the sauce began to bubble, adding the remaining onions only afterward to preserve their crispness. From an ordinary weekday side dish, green bean casserole gradually found its way onto Thanksgiving tables and into meals shared by large gatherings. It was easy to prepare ahead of time, easy to carry to a neighbor's house, and warm enough to place among the many waiting plates. 3 convenience ingredients came together on one holiday table. Dish number 12, Jell-O salad. The gelatin mold trembled slightly as it was placed on a glass plate. Beneath the clear, colored gelatin, pieces of fruit, shredded carrots or nuts remained still, as though preserved in a single moment of summer. In 1956, a package of flavored gelatin cost about 9 cents. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, and many parts of the Midwest, gelatin molds often appeared in church basements, on holiday tables, and in homes that had recently acquired electric refrigerators. He dissolved the gelatin in boiling water, listening as the sugar crystals disappeared beneath the circling spoon, then added cold water. Canned fruit, shredded vegetables, or sour cream was folded in before the mixture was poured into the mold. After several hours of chilling, she dipped the bottom of the mold into warm water, placed a plate over it, and quickly turned it upside down with both hands. When the gelatin slipped from the mold intact, the quiet breaths around the table eased as well. That gentle trembling once spoke of a modern kitchen, one with a refrigerator, time for preparation and care in the way a dish was presented. At the time, a wobble was modern. Dish number 11, ambrosia salad, bright citrus, golden pineapple, and red cherries rested in a footed glass bowl. Between the layers of fruit were white coconut and marshmallows that had softened after spending hours in the cold. In Atlanta, Georgia, in 1956, a can of pineapple cost about 33 cents. Fruit cocktail cost about 27 cents. Ambrosia was often brought to church suppers, Christmas tables, and Thanksgiving meals, where the bowl glowed beneath yellow lights. She drained the oranges and pineapple thoroughly, preventing the fruit juice from making the cream too thin. Coconut, marshmallows, and sour cream or whipped cream were added in portions and gently folded together with a spoon. The bowl was placed in the refrigerator early so the marshmallows could soften and the fruit flavors could blend into the cream. The ingredients came from cans and bags, but the way she drained, mixed, chilled, and chose the most beautiful bowl transformed them into a dish meant for a meaningful day. The bowl glowed beneath the holiday lights, the cards that did not need to be read. The recipe box was opened again. The green bean card carried a dried streak of soup in one corner. A piece of a pineapple label was tucked beside the ambrosia recipe. On the final line was a penciled reminder, chill before the celebration. Those cards preserved the order of an entire day. Which dish had to go into the refrigerator in the morning? Which bowl needed to be taken to church? What time the family had to leave the house? The box held the ingredients while also preserving the rhythm of the life that had once unfolded around them. Canned goods and gelatin changed the post-war kitchen, but when a hearty plate was needed, she still returned to rice, potatoes, noodles, milk, and butter, starch, milk, and plates that kept families full. After the brightly colored bowls on post-war dining tables, meals returned to more familiar ingredients. Some dishes sat beside the meat, quietly soaking up gravy, butter, and milk while keeping the plate full. Rice, potatoes, and pasta each required a skill of their own. She had to know how much more liquid they needed and when to stop before their texture became too soft or dry and hard. Dish number. Rice pilaf, the uncooked grains of rice rolled across the bottom of the pot in hot butter, making a faint rustling sound like the first rain of the season touching the window panes. In the Mission District of San Francisco in 1958, a pound of rice cost about 17 cents. In a neighborhood where Italian and Armenian families lived side by side, the method of sautéing rice in butter and then cooking it in broth gradually became familiar in many American kitchens. She melted the butter, poured in the rice, and stirred until every grain turned pale gold. Onion was added and slowly softened in the warm scent of butter. Then she poured in the broth, dropped in a bay leaf, and covered the pot tightly. The rice rested over low heat, allowing each grain to gradually absorb the meat-flavored liquid. When she lifted the lid, she gently fluffed the rice with a fork so the steam could rise and the grains would separate. Pilaf was often placed beside roast chicken or a meat dish on evenings when guests came over. An everyday ingredient suddenly took on a more formal appearance. Refinement began at the bottom of the pot. Dish number 9. Scalloped potatoes, thin slices of potato, were layered in a baking dish, while the milk rose nearly 3/4 of the way up the sides. A few small pieces of butter rested on top, waiting to melt. In 1956, in St. Louis, Missouri, 10 pounds of potatoes cost about 56 cents, while a quart of milk cost about 22 cents. This potato dish was often served with ham or roast meat, or brought to a parish supper. She sliced the potatoes evenly and arranged them in layers with salt, pepper, and a little flour. The milk was poured slowly around the edge of the dish so it could seep between the layers. When the oven door closed, the kitchen gradually filled with the scent of hot butter and thickening milk. Through the oven window, she watched the milk bubble around the sides. The surface of the potatoes turned golden, and the thin edges begin to curl. The dish required more time than mashed potatoes, so it usually belonged to Sundays, holidays, or evenings when visitors came. She looked through the oven door and knew when the dish was ready. Dish number 8, macaroni and cheese. The spoon moved through the pot, leaving a short trail before the golden sauce slowly flowed back around the curved pieces of macaroni. In Pittsburgh in 1956, American cheese cost about 58 cents per pound, while milk cost about 22 cents per quart. This was a familiar dish at midweek suppers, church suppers, and on days when young children needed a plate of something easy to eat. She boiled the macaroni, drained it, and returned it to the pot with butter, milk, and whatever cheese remained in the refrigerator. The wooden spoon stirred slowly until the sauce coated every piece of macaroni. When the mixture thickened too quickly, she added a little milk. When the sauce was still thin, she left the pot over low heat for a few more minutes, or folded in more cheese. Some households began with a butter and flour sauce. Others put everything directly into that. Flavor changed with the ingredients that remained, with the spoon doing the stirring and with the person standing beside the stove. No two pots were alike. Rice, potatoes, and pasta had kept supper filling. The old kitchen also knew how to give what remained a new purpose. Cold rice, oats, sugar, and the last little bit of milk could still become dessert. That wasted nothing sugar spoke in a language quieter than the sound of oil in a skillet. It appeared in the rings of bubbles rising around the sides of a pot, in the light reflected on the surface of chocolate, and in the gradually changing weight of a wooden spoon. The cook had to stay close, watch for a long time, and understand that even a few seconds could change the entire dish. Leftover rice, oats, milk, and sugar still had value, but to turn them into the sweet course at the end of a meal, she had to know when to stir, when to lift the pot from the heat, and when to let everything set on its own. Number 7. Rice pudding. A bowl of rice from the previous evening sat in the refrigerator. The grains hardened and stuck together in a cold mass. In many kitchens, that rice still had another job waiting for it. 1955, on New York's Lower East Side, rice cost about 18 cents per pound, while a quart of milk cost nearly 22 cents. In the crowded apartments of immigrant working-class neighborhoods, little leftover rice could become dessert with milk, sugar, and sometimes spent the stove. She placed the rice in a pot and added milk, sugar, a pinch of salt, and a few raisins if any remained in the jar. The mixture was cooked over low heat. The wooden spoon moved slowly around the sides of the pot, breaking apart each clump of rice until the grains became soft again. The scent of hot milk blended with sugar and cinnamon, gradually filling the kitchen. She tilted the spoon, watched the layer of milk cling to the wood, and then run down in a slow ribbon. The pudding still needed to be soft enough to spoon, because it would continue to thicken as it cooled. The pot was removed from the heat earlier than a new cook might think necessary. After a night spent in the cold, the leftover rice had found another life. Leftover rice was not finished. Number 6. No-bake cookies. In the small pot, cocoa, milk, butter, and sugar began to boil. Large rings of bubbles rose from the center, pushed against one another, burst around the sides of the pot in a steady, urgent rhythm. She stood beside it, watching the clock on the wall, but experience still lay in the way the boiling bubbles held their shape. In 1958, in Columbus, Ohio, a 20-ounce package of oats cost about 19 cents. A 5-pound bag of sugar sold for nearly 52 cents, while peanut butter cost about 55 cents per pound. Those familiar ingredients were well suited to school bake sales, community events, or evenings when the family wanted something sweet while the oven was occupied. She brought the mixture to a hard boil and kept it there for exactly about 1 minute. Then the pot was lifted from the heat, and the peanut butter, vanilla, and oats were stirred in quickly. The scent of cocoa deepened and blended with the warm aroma of roasted nuts. She spooned individual portions onto wax paper before the mixture began to harden in the pot. If the boiling time was too short, the cookies would remain soft and sticky on the paper. If it went on any longer, they would become dry, crumbly, and easy to break. In that kitchen, one brief minute held years of practiced skill. 1 minute decided the entire batch. Dish number 5. Chocolate fudge. At first, the chocolate mixture shone like a surface of dark glass. The wooden spoon moved through the pot, leaving a deep trail that immediately filled in again. But after several minutes of steady beating, that shine began to fade, and the weight against her wrist changed as well. In 1955, the coal regions around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, sugar cost about 52 cents for a 5-pound bag, butter nearly 71 cents per pound, and chocolate about 5 cents per ounce. In December, fudge was cut into small squares, arranged in paper-lined tins, and carried to neighbors' homes as a family gift. She cooked the sugar, milk, butter, and chocolate in a heavy-bottomed pot. The mixture reached the necessary stage of boiling. She dropped a small amount into a bowl of cold water. Her fingertips gathered the sugar together, testing whether it formed a soft ball or still dissolved. Once the test drop was ready, the pot was set down. She beat the mixture with a wooden spoon until the surface of the chocolate gradually lost its shine, becoming thick and slightly dull beneath the light. Fudge had to be poured into a buttered pan at that exact moment. A few beats too late, and it would set in the pot. A few beats too soon, and the texture would remain soft and difficult to cut. The thermometer could provide a number, but she read the answer in the bowl of cold water and in the feeling in her wrist. She knew when the shine disappeared. The sweet dishes brought the meal to a close with the scents of milk, cocoa, and hot sugar. But the final 4 cards in the recipe box told of something larger than dessert. They brought the story back to the main table, where the lid was lifted from the pot of meat, the potatoes were passed from hand to hand, the skillet of chicken was set down, and a supper became a shared memory for the entire family. The final 4 cards and a true 1950s family supper. As the list neared its end, the kitchen grew quieter. The cold bowls and gelatin molds had been cleared from the table. On the stove remained a pot of braised beef, hot potatoes, a skillet of chicken, and a meatloaf pan waiting nearby. The final 4 dishes used 4 different ways of reading supper. Time tenderized the beef. The pressure of the hands determined the potatoes. Sound guided the skillet of chicken. By the final dish, the recipe had become a feeling held in the palm of the hand. Dish number 4, pot roast. The smell of browned meat, onions, and celery had traveled through the house for hours before the lid of the pot was lifted. Flung to the curtains, drifted into the hallway, and greeted those returning home from the moment they reached the front steps. In Cleveland, Ohio, in 1957, beef chuck cost about 50 cents per pound, while onions cost about 8 cents. For many families of machine tool workers, this was a Sunday dish, when the pot had enough time to sit low on the stove. She coated the meat with flour, salt, and pepper, and browned each side in hot fat. The strong sizzle at the beginning gradually softened as a dark crust formed. The meat was lifted out. Onions, carrots, and celery were sautéed in the remaining fat, absorbing the browned bits from the bottom of the pot. She returned the meat to the pot, added water, and covered it. From that point on, the kitchen worked through waiting. The low heat traveled deep into the tough fibers of the meat, gradually tenderizing them hour by hour. She let time do the rest. Dish number 3, mashed potatoes. The lid had barely been lifted when steam from the potatoes rose and fogged a section of the window near the sink. A pat of butter was dropped in while the potatoes were still hot, melting into a golden streak through the soft whiteness. In 1955, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, 10 pounds of potatoes cost about 56 cents, while butter cost about 71 cents per pound. Mashed potatoes accompanied beef, pork chops, fried chicken, and nearly every serving of gravy that needed somewhere to settle. She boiled the potatoes until a fork passed through them without resistance and drained the water and began to mash. The metal masher struck the bottom of the pot with heavy, even sounds. The butter was mixed in first. Warm milk was added a little at a time because pouring in too much at once could make the potatoes loose and watery, while mashing them too long made the texture sticky. Knowing how to make this dish was once the mark of someone experienced in the kitchen. The potatoes revealed the pressure of the hands, the amount of liquid, and even the cook's patience. Her hands knew when to stop. Dish number 2, fried chicken. The first piece of chicken met the oil with a powerful hiss. Bubbles of fat rose around the coating, and then the sound gradually softened as the pale gold color deepened to amber. In Birmingham, Alabama, in 1955, ready-to-cook chicken cost about 57 cents per pound. while a 5-pound bag of flour cost about 54 cents. Fried chicken belonged to Sunday afternoons, meals after church services, the days when guests came through the door. She cut the chicken into pieces, soaked them in buttermilk, and coated them in seasoned flour. The pieces that took the longest to cook went in first. She left space between each piece in the skillet so the heat could move evenly around the crust. She turned the chicken once, watching the color and listening as the sound of the oil changed. When the crust was crisp, the sound in the skillet became quieter and drier. She lifted out each piece, letting the fat fall in shining drops before placing it on the platter. The skillet announced when supper was ready. Dish number 1, Meatloaf. 2 hands closed around the mixture of meat, eggs, bread, and onions. She squeezed gently, opened her hands, and touched it once more, as though the answer lay in the moisture between her fingers. In 1957, in an automobile workers' neighborhood in Detroit, ground beef cost about 40 cents per pound, while bread cost about 18 cents. 1 meatloaf was enough to feed the whole family on Tuesday evening and leave a few slices for the next morning's lunchboxes. She placed the meat in a bowl and added eggs, breadcrumbs, onions, salt, pepper, and ketchup. Each ingredient was added in portions. She mixed everything by hand, feeling whether the mixture was still loose or moist enough to hold its shape. When it felt right in her hands, she pressed the meat into the pan, spread a layer of ketchup over the top, and placed it in the oven. The smell of onions, roasting meat, and hot ketchup gradually filled the room. Through the oven door, she watched the top darken and the edges of the loaf pull slightly away from the sides of the pan. Meatloaf stretched the meat, organized supper, saved a portion for the next day, gathered all the kitchen skill into one very small movement. By this point, the recipe had moved beyond numbers. It rested in the palm of her hand. 25 dishes had passed through the kitchen, from green tomatoes picked before the frost to the meatloaf just lifted from its pan. On the table, the final 4 cards had been read. The old recipe box was waiting to be closed. 25 suppers had passed through different kitchens, from the Chicago garden before the frost to the Kansas City skillet of pork chops, the Newark soup pot, the cold Baltimore salad bowl, gelatin mold on a Minnesota church table, and the dish of scalloped potatoes in a St. Louis oven. The story continued through a pudding pot on the Lower East Side, a Sunday afternoon skillet of chicken in Birmingham, then returned to the meatloaf pan in a Detroit worker's home. Some dishes began with an egg. Others began with a can of soup, leftover rice, or a piece of meat that needed to be kept moist. Every dish required someone who knew how to listen to the sound of the oil, feel the weight of the spoon, and recognize the moment to stop. In the kitchen of the 1950s, her hands remembered supper. They remembered how much milk to add, the sound of a crust that had turned crisp, and the feel of the meatloaf mixture when it held just enough moisture. The final card was returned to the recipe box. One corner of the paper bore a dried ketchup stain. The words Detroit, 1957 had faded, and beneath them remained a penciled sentence. Mix until it feels right in your hands. The lid of the box closed. The cast iron skillet rested quietly. Outside the window, the rows of workers' houses had gone dark. When one of these dishes brings back a memory of an old kitchen, leave its name below. To keep opening cards like these, subscribe to the channel. Each week, another chair is pulled a little closer to the stove. Dinner has passed. The hands still remember.